Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. Joining me on today's episode is a very special guest, Vijay Prashad. He is a historian, author, and journalist, serving as the executive director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and chief editor of Leftward Books. Vijay, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Nice to see you.
Likewise. I want to start off by asking you, why do you think there is no real left mass politics in the United States today? We see the rise of the right and the alt-right. It seems like there'd be an open opportunity for the left, but it has failed to take any sort of substantial root.
It's a complicated question, and it's not, it begs a serious and detailed look at US history, really. The short answer is that the left, every time it arises, has faced extraordinary repression. And I don't think we should underestimate that. The capacity of the US state to repress people of the left movements, to repress left ideas is actually quite extraordinary. And the fact that the US state can get away with this in the name of liberalism is really, if I had a cap, I would doff it to them. You can have McCarthyism, you can execute people, you can have the Pinkertons smash trade unions as a private security force, and you can still show up at the League of Nations meeting and say, we want freedom and liberty in the world. This capacity for repression with a big smile and in the name of liberalism is incredible. Don't underestimate that. The other thing that I think is important is what Marx writes about. Marx writes in Capital that you can't liberate, he says, the white skin unless you liberate the black skin. And I think racism, or the use of racism by the ruling class, has been incredibly effective to turn people against each other. The capacity of the kind of talking classes, the chattering classes, again, to smile and be liberals and say the most god-awful things about people who come from other countries and so on. I mean, who makes the United States run? It's a combination of a range of the working class. There are people who have ancestry in Europe. There's a lot of people with ancestry in Africa and Latin America. That's the working class. The US working class has always been multi-ethnic. The great trade union movements were set up by people speaking Yiddish, speaking Lithuanian, speaking Polish. That's how they organized their branches. But a lot of that history is suppressed, forgotten. People forget that they came from somewhere, after taking the land from the native people and so on. Marx astutely observes in Capital Volume 1, he says, you cannot liberate the white skin if you don't liberate the black. And I think that's a statement about, the inability, in a sense, of movements to bridge these divides and to speak to older, working class sections that don't really remember their own roots in Europe and so on. And the fact that, their enemy is not the person from Mexico or wherever. Their enemy is a class enemy. And I think that, to my mind, is a real social challenge for the left in the United States after being repressed.
I fully agree with you. And I think we, of course, see that even still today. But why do you think it is that there are left organizations in the United States? Why do you think that they have such difficulty in winning over the hearts and minds of truckers and farmers in America who are otherwise funneled into the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? Why is it that these groups really can't get any sort of traction with these working class Americans?
Yeah, I mean, this is the it's a question for the ages. And, in a short time, we're not going to be able to really get deep into this. But a few points that just come to mind. I'm not a very deep scholar of this issue, but I have watched this very perplexing question, and I've not understood why the US, let's say, left movement has not been able to root itself in its culture in a way. This is a question really of the vast magnitude of the United States. I come from India, which has a very strong communist movement. Of course, it's weak in terms of national politics, but it's strong. And one of the reasons that it's strong, recognized early on, that what you really need is you need to have a communist movement in Tamil Nadu that speaks Tamil, that has an understanding of the Tamilian struggles for social justice, that links to the left Dravidian movement in Tamil Nadu and so on. The United States cannot have one left culture. It has to have a left in Idaho, a left in Nebraska. It has to go back and understand the histories of the left. I mean, you take the case of the US Midwest. Some years ago, my friend Jeffrey St. Clair edited a book called Red State Rebels. I was actually very interested reading that book. I didn't realize that in Nebraska and places like that, the farmers had built their own credit unions, socialist credit unions, where farmers would effectively take care of each other when there were problems. Farming is a very complicated and dangerous business, because you are at the mercy of the weather, you're at the mercy of nature. And so you need to create economic structures that protect you. And I didn't realize that in the early 20th century, really the experience of German and Lithuanian and other socialisms helped the farmers create credit unions. That's within the history of those states, where now in Wyoming, where Dick Cheney ruled the roost. Wyoming had a left history. To lift that up, to create, in a sense, a Wyoming tradition of left-wingness, to in a way reach people in Wyoming. A federated culture is what the United States is. And I think the idea of building left movements with one left culture across the country may not work. And this is an experience we bring from India, kind of federated cultural understanding. California's left history is not going to be the same as Wyoming. You can't have the same storyline for very different people, different experiences, and they should be proud of their left history. I think that's important. You've got minor struggles, you've got, in West Virginia, I've never understood why the miners struggle against the Pinkertons. The film Matewan, what a great film. These histories of the left are so important for people. It makes you proud of your ancestors, not hate them, not be dismayed by them, not be told that your ancestors are beneath respect. Every part of the world has a left history that we can turn to build our own confidence and dignity.
Yes, we need to embrace the American history, the American characteristics, of course, throwing aside the backwards parts of it, but moving forward with what is historically progressive. One big problem that I think I've noticed in the American left is the issue of just Fed jacketing without any sort of evidence or backing to, back these claims up. Do you think that this is a problem in the American left? And if so, who do you think it serves?
What's that term you used? I'm not familiar with it. Fed jacking.
Fed jacketing is, for example, if I were to say, a certain person who's organizing workers in West Virginia, if I said, I don't like that person's views on gender, even though they're doing good work organizing the workers in West Virginia, I think they must be CIA. And without any proof, you say that they're CIA or they're FBI or something like that just to make them look bad.
Oh, I mean, I didn't know this term, but it's really interesting. I mean, I'll give you a personal example. I'm accused online sometimes of being funded by Goldman Sachs. It's an absurd accusation. You know, if you have a bank account in a bank, Chase Manhattan or whatever, you're not funded by them. You know, it's a crazy idea, but these things spread. The internet is both a very valuable resource for knowledge and understanding, but it's also the sewer. You know, below the street is the sewer, and in a way you sort of need the sewer. You've got to get your shit to go somewhere. Yeah, and that's what comes out in the internet. And I think this form of accusations of people, this loose kind of dismissals, is a very strange politics. It comes from a politics that I think of as a politics of perfection and a politics of superiority. You know, doesn't understand that firstly, lots of people we all come from a contradictory heritage. Okay, all of us, we all inherit. Gramsci says the people have a contradictory consciousness. You know, they carry some stuff that's just not great. You know, they're told by somebody when they're young, they inherit ideas that are not great. You know, we all have some not great ideas. Okay, let's not do an inventory of your and my not great ideas. I would prefer it not to be on the record, but you get the point. We all have some not great ideas. We also have good ideas. And what Gramsci says is we try to elaborate the best part of working class consciousness. We try to elaborate, and he uses this lovely word, elaborate. We take the best parts of working class consciousness, we elaborate. We don't pull people down. You know, somebody says something inappropriate, we take them aside and hug them and say, listen, brother, listen, sister, that may not be the best way to make your point, you know, known, because, you know, it can be misunderstood. That's a private conversation that is educating our brothers and sisters with love, not with pulling them down, not with attacking them. You can't build a new society by attacking people, you know, just randomly and maliciously. You know, what is this fed jacking? You can't maliciously attack people. Yes, it's dumb. We want to build a beautiful world, you know, where people don't have to live with genocide and they don't have to live with starvation, and workers who are working hard should get the fruits of their labor. That's the world we want to live in. But this whole thing of tearing people down seems to me, you know, it's just malicious. It's ugly. It's not how you build the future. There's this politics of perfection. You know, somehow people, particularly on the internet, think that they are superior to others and they just run them down. My opinion is there's got to be a sewer. I know that. But I would prefer to put my sewer to work attacking, let's say, Marco Rubio, who's a genuine nutcase and deserves to be attacked. He's a flea brain. I mean, I would attack him in a malicious way. Yeah, I would fed jack him if I, at any moment. But why would you attack somebody who's, 23 years old trying to organize workers somewhere? I think that I think is what you do is you go, you hug them and you whisper in their ear and say, sister, brother, this is not the best way to get your point across. But hey, listen, you who's doing the fed jacking, pick a better target, man. Go after somebody who's a real bully. Don't bully somebody who's trying to do something but has a contradictory consciousness.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. A lot of people in the United States would say that America has like culturally traditional values, I guess, that's kind of in the country's DNA. And a lot of people disagree with that, obviously. But what do you think about countries like Venezuela and the KPRF, China, arguably, Burkina Faso, Nicaragua, who have a certain Marxism that, when adapted to their own historical traditions, it comes out as culturally conservative or culturally traditional? Do you think there's any room for that in the United States?
Well, look, I mean, every territory in the world has a cultural history. and has a journey that it's making. Um, and we have to understand that. So, for instance, let's take the case of China. It's a good example. China is a 3,000 plus year, very much a cultural heritage which they inherited. But right after the Chinese Revolution, it's not like Mao and Zhou Enlai and others sat around and said, well, let's just tolerate our 3,000-year tradition. No, they said, firstly, landlordism isn't just the control on land, the ownership of land. Landlordism is a cultural thing. First, they said we got to get rid of landlordism. In other words, okay, let's say you're a landlord and I'm your peasant, and I'm walking towards you. Yeah, I would walk hunched, not making eye contact to you. That's landlordism. Yeah, a woman binding her feet, again hunched. The landlord saying, "I want to sleep with that woman." That's landlordism. And the Chinese communists said, we don't care if this is in our culture. We're not going to allow it. Landlords, you firstly no longer are going to control the land. Secondly, you can't behave like that. And now in China, people don't walk around with their looking down. They look up, they look straight at you. Yeah. That's an enormous advance in Chinese culture. They actually transformed the culture. Cuba is the same. You're in Cuba, it's a very poor country, racked by the blockade, brutalized by the United States. Yeah. It's a country with a large black population. Nobody looks down. They give straight eye contact. I always say when I meet a Cuban anywhere that you are the ninjas of the Americas. I can spot you. You're like Obi-Wan Kenobi. You are enlightened warriors of Marxism, because your culture has been transformed. So it's not that one just takes a culture and says, well, there's good and bad. We have to live with it. You have to assess the movement in a society, what people are doing, how they are understanding themselves, what changes are taking place and so on. Some of these changes are very difficult for people to stomach easily. I understand that. But we are fighters for full human dignity. Our issue is not to say, look, I don't like those forms of cultural transformation. I only like these. You can't choose like that. People are fighting in all fronts for all kinds of different things in every society. And a society has to at some point come to terms with multiple forms of dignity claims. Obviously, there is a kind of sort of a cultural bedrock that has to be negotiated. In China, for instance, the Chinese Communist Party has not been able to undermine the respect for elders, for instance. Now, personally, I'm fine with the respect for elders. I like to show elders respect. That's also my own history and my own understanding. I would never be able to say an expletive to one of my elders, for instance. I just wouldn't be able to insult somebody and so on. So the Chinese Communist Party is basically adopted the respect for elders. And there's a great hierarchy in how things operate. Well, that's not so bad, actually. That doesn't impinge on dignity. That's what I'm trying to get at, is that it's not a question of culture. It's a question of dignity. You and I cannot tolerate if somebody's dignity is being taken away. That should not be tolerable, but I don't mind things like hierarchies because of elders. That doesn't take anybody's dignity away. That's just simply a recognition that we come from an old world where we respected the wisdom of older people. I am against taking older people in a wheelchair and shoving them in old people's home. But I understand the value of that. It also can be good for older people that they have friends and things. I get that. It's not a warehouse. But we must respect older people. As the left, for instance, it's important that we go and talk to older people, get their histories, an older trade union comrade, listen to them. What are they trying to say and so on? There are things in culture that we have to come to terms with. But there are other things, and I take this lesson from the Chinese Communist Party. There are other things that we simply say, no, no, we cannot accept that. You talked about the DPRK, North Korea. North Korea transformed the relations between men and women. It's actually very interesting. It's true that the leaders have been men. Okay, I get that, but forget that. Everyday life in North Korea, women are far more able to do things in North Korean society than in South Korean society. It shows you the impact of the early years of communist North Korea, where they basically, with a Gordian knot, cut the domestic work issue, saying that men and women must do domestic work. Same with Burkina Faso. Thomas Sankara gave so many interesting speeches saying, hey, listen, guys, we're going to have to change relations inside the home. That's important for us. If we want to advance as a society, women must have the light of dignity shining in them as much as men. So your point is very well taken. Culture is extremely stubborn. Culture doesn't bend like economics, or it doesn't bend like politics. It's extremely stubborn. You got to acknowledge the cultural relations that exist. But as people of the left, we also say, I see you, culture, I acknowledge you, culture, but I also want to shine the light of dignity. And these things sometimes come into clash.
I think it's important what you said about establishing the cultural bedrock and what is a backwards part of culture and what is not, what's something that could be either taken and elaborated upon or improved upon. But those countries, they differ from the American left, the US left, in the sense that when it comes to LGBT issues, they say, this being forced upon us is a form of cultural imperialism. This is foreign to us. This is, again, Venezuela, Nicaragua, DPRK, Burkina Faso. Some of these countries have laws against homosexuality. So how do you square that with an American tradition, which by and large the country, according to the polls, they obviously don't disapprove of gay marriage according to the polls, but some of the more radical elements that we see embraced by different groups in America, they do flat out reject.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I would stay with Cuba and China for a minute. Cuba has a family law that is much more radical than any family law in the world. And it took the Cuban Revolution decades to get to that family law. China, for instance, decriminalized homosexuality in 1997. It took years for the Chinese to say, well, look, shine the light of dignity. It's not a big deal. People want to have, two men want to have a relationship. That's not criminal anymore. It's up to you to do that. It's not a matter of the state. Very interesting. It takes time in a society and a culture to come to terms with these things. The issue that you're talking about is twofold that I think is important to discuss. One is just broadly cultural imperialism, where anybody just says, look, this is the way people must live. We live like this, so you should live like this. That's just flat out imperialism. For the United States, for instance, to preach to anybody about, LGBTQ issues, the CIA making an LGBTQ ad is ludicrous. The United States repressed homosexuality for decades, and there was the Lavender Menace. They went after homosexual communists in the 1950s with ferocity. The US shouldn't lecture anybody on these things. And frankly, that advertisement from the CIA was ludicrous, with the saying, this whole helicopter crew is LGBTQ. That doesn't help a kid who's killed in Waziristan by a bomb, friend. It's not like a pride bomb. Yeah, it's grotesque. So that's cultural imperialism. I completely reject that. I think that's ludicrous. People will have their own debates and histories. The United States shouldn't lecture anybody about anything, I would say. The second thing that you mentioned, which is very important, is a kind of NGOization of the left, where NGO issues frame left-wing discussions. And the left should not become effectively a serial NGO organization, by which I mean NGOs are one-issue groups. We are a LGBT group, we are a group for healthcare, we are a group for this, we are a group for that, anti-racist. The left is not a serial issue group, 20 issues put together like a train car pulled by a locomotive. The left has to have a broad theory of social change, in which all kinds of dignity claims can be made and debated and discussed and so on. But I mean, at the heart of it, the left has to fight to organize the working class, has to build confidence and clarity among working people. That has to be the actual engine of the left, not the sort of NGO culture. It's what the debate within Die Linke in Germany is all about. Whether Die Linke has become too NGOized. It's picked up these sort of serial issues, which each of them by themselves have merit. But if you behave like basically a NGO, you're not a left organization in terms of understanding that the real issue has to be to give confidence and clarity and discipline to a working class movement, not a movement of the middle class, with its sort of NGOized, complaints. I mean, middle class should be an ally of a left movement, but it shouldn't drive the agenda of the movement. That's how I would understand on this issue. I don't have any problem with dignity claims of a range. That's fine. People must make their claims. But a left organization must understand itself simply behind the two issues of, are we building a confident working class that's able to fight, and does the working class have clarity about the nature of the fight? These are confidence and clarity. These are the watchwords.
I agree. So you think it would be wrong for people in America to say condemn Burkina Faso or Venezuela or Nicaragua for having, conservative values as, Marxist leaders when it comes to LGBT issues?
Well, really, to condemn a poor country and its left for trying to build a left is, on the face of it, ridiculous. To condemn a poor country. These are poor countries. Many of them have never had, because of colonialism, the development of a bourgeoisie. Okay, Burkina Faso, in our institute, we just released a dossier called the Sahel Seeks Sovereignty, which is built on what's happening in the Sahel, the association of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali. I know this region very well, spent time there, and so on. The French never allowed a bourgeoisie to develop. There's no bourgeois culture in these countries. The bourgeoisie is completely parasitic and dependent on France. So there's no bourgeois culture. So then to turn around to these countries and say, well, why don't you have a bourgeois culture, is ludicrous. They will have their own history. They didn't have 100 years of, the Carnegie cultural museums, and they didn't have the Ford Foundation, and they didn't have, all these, whatever, Central Park and all the stuff that the bourgeoisie builds first for itself and then out of charity and good-heartedness invites the public. You don't have all that stuff, You go to Columbus, Ohio, the big titans of industry in the center of the city. They have museums, they have art galleries. There's no bourgeois forms like that in Ouagadougou. The bourgeoisie or whatever parasitic group in Ouagadougou would fly to Paris to enjoy the Louvre and the this and the that. So it's ludicrous for somebody, a professor at Columbia University or a student radical in Boston, to say, oh, these people are that. You don't understand the context of these countries. That's the issue. Even Venezuela, it never really developed its own bourgeoisie. All those years of oil wealth, the bourgeoisie was totally parasitic on the United States and on Spain. Totally parasitic. There really isn't an independent Venezuelan bourgeois culture that is well formed. Who are the great authors of that bourgeoisie and so on, they're parasitic. I mean, Alfonso Perez, one of the great hydrocarbons ministers, who was a conservative, wrote a book called Oil is the Devil's Excrement. What he meant by that is this oil, the devil's shit, in fact, is really the title of the book. This oil has really corrupted our ability to create, a world, a culture, a society, bring our people along. We have a bourgeoisie utterly, fascinated by New York and so on. So you can't turn around and say these are backward people. These are people who've experienced colonialism, which, is an experience that hasn't come to Columbus, Ohio in that sense, that sense.
I have one last question for you. I'll make it quick, and thank you for your time. Do you think that it is possible to have a peaceful socialist revolution? And have there been any in history that we can think of?
Well, I'm talking to you from Santiago, Chile, where I live. And in Santiago, there was a left government that came to power through an election in 1970. But then 3 years later, it experienced a terrible coup. And then thousands of people were killed, repressed, went into exile, and so on. There are many experiences where the left prevails through the ballot box, but then the repression they face because the people are not prepared to defend their government is enormous. I mean, the case of Venezuela is exemplary. Ballot box entry of a left political formation, but the repression they face is incredible. They keep trying to mobilize the people, but it's not easy. It's not easy to do that. Personally, it's very hard nowadays to see in an advanced country like the United States to see anything other than electoral paths at the present to come to some position of authority. Look, the main thing in a place like the United States is not even right now to think about seizure of power. The main thing to think about is to reorganizing the working class, to build, again, the word is confidence of people that an alternative is possible, to show people what an alternative would look like, to be very brave in bringing the working class to a new consciousness. That's the task in the richer parts of the world, which are going to face real turbulence with the rise of Asia, particularly China. They're not going to be able to compete with China. The US cannot compete with China. In the next 10 years, it's going to be very complicated for the United States. We're going to see a lot of working class dismay, anger, a lot of anti-China rhetoric. I think it's a responsibility of the left in the United States to equip the working class with the theory that it's not a China question. It's a question of the United States has liberated its billionaires to basically take all the social wealth, share none of it. Bezos has an ambition of being the world's first trillionaire. There is no human in China who has such a vulgar ambition. They are simply not allowed to have ambitions like that. What kind of ambition is that, Jeff Bezos, to be the first trillionaire? That's not a great thing, pal. And by the way, you got divorced and lost a lot of your money. You put your clock back. Maybe you'll get defeated by Elon Musk, but that's not an ambition. And that has to be something you equip the working class with, is that take them out of this anti-China rhetoric, understand the realities, and rebuild the United States. It needs new infrastructure. You need high-speed rail. You don't need automobiles. You need more trains. You need more connectivity. You need people to feel like they belong to a country. Why does it take so god-awfully long to get from the Midwest to the coast? Why should I fly in a plane, get in a train 300 kilometers an hour, straight dashing track, In an hour, I'm in from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Why does it take so long? Why do I have to get on a plane? So expensive. Working class people can't afford these things. That's the equipment, the mental equipment the left must provide. I mean, it's going to be tough because, the last thing we want is to send unemployed factory workers from the United States to war against the Chinese. That's the last thing we want. We want peace, but to get peace, you have to equip the working class. I'll leave you with this line because I think it's interesting. Marx wrote and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto, the working class of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. About 50 years later, Rosa Luxemburg wrote a really interesting line. And this was in the context of the Great War of 1914. Luxemburg wrote, working class unite during peacetime. During war, they slit each other's throats.
That seems to be where we're unfortunately headed. So I hope we can avoid that, God willing, and we can continue to unite the working class, even in the midst of all the warmongers, machinations against China, the Middle East, Russia, and whoever else. So Vijay Prashad, thank you so much for joining me. I enjoyed our conversation. Where is the best place to follow you to stay up to date with your work moving forward?
Well, it's always on Twitter, which, I go to the middle of the night like most people to beat insomnia. So it's always dangerous to take Twitter things seriously. But really, it's thetricontinental.org.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Take care of yourself.